My name is Alexia Leaders. I'm the General Manager of Strategic Innovation and Enterprise at the Australian Institute of Architects. Today's session I'm really excited for a few reasons. I'd like to welcome Matthew Schneider, who's the Director of Planning at Urbis on the Gold Coast. Matthew's quite famous at the Gold Coast and on LinkedIn and in economics and planning generally. So if you don't know of him already, I strongly advise that you jump on LinkedIn and add him and follow all of his insights. Today, I think the presentation is going to be quite meaningful for two different reasons. We're looking at what opportunities exist on the Gold Coast to expand your businesses and services and what's happening on the Gold Coast. But also, Matthew has very special insight in that he's established Urbis on the Gold Coast. So not only can he walk the walk, but he's talk the talk at the same time. So he's done both parts together, whether you get them right way around or not. And so it's very unusual to hear from somebody that will be giving deep insights that has done both parts, because it's definitely hard yards establishing yourself in a new market. So for those of you that don't have relationships on the Gold Coast already, there's some special insight there that you'll get from Matthew, in addition to his awareness of what's happening economically and planning and property area on the Gold Coast. I want to mention that Matthew is possibly one of the busiest people that I've ever heard of in my life. He sits on 10 committees. So I just want to give you some insight which will help you understand the breadth of knowledge that you're getting from Matthew today. Apologies for reading these out, but I just have to, and you'll see why once I get through them. In addition to leading the Gold Coast Planning Services for Urbis, Matthew is an adjunct industry fellow at the Cities Research Institute. He's a City Heart Task Force executive member. He's a business advisory board member at Study Gold Coast. He's a Gold Coast Music Advisory Group member, which I really love. Shows the holistic personality that we're getting from Matthew today. Gold Coast Light Rail Business Advisory Group member. Lacey Group Advisory Committee member. Also an advocate for women in construction with his position in Top 100 Women and Advisory Board member. Is a Property Industry Advisory Committee member at Bond University. And that concludes the 10 committee positions that he holds, in addition to his full-time role in leading the team on the Gold Coast. As we get into today's presentation, the first question that I wanted to ask Matthew was why he's so passionate about the Gold Coast and what's attracted and kept him in the Gold Coast market. And as he leads into that, there'll be three parts to today's presentation. So I want to run you through how we're going to run today. So the first part of Matthew's presentation will be his reflections on the Urbis experience and the Gold Coast. Then we'll open up to questions. Then he'll talk about the state of the city. We'll open up to questions again. And then we'll look at emerging opportunities as they apply to the AIA members and the audience in the room. As you always do in every session, please put your questions in the chat box. And when we open up to question time for each of the relevant areas, I will run through them with Matthew on your behalf. So opening up to Matthew with my leading question before he gets into his presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexia. It's a very generous introduction. Thank you. And thanks to the Institute for having me along for today, and to all of you for taking the time out of your day. I'll endeavour to make it a worthwhile use of your time. Yeah, what do I love the Gold? That was a question, wasn't it? I've got a lot running through my mind. It's just a fascinating place to do business and a fascinating city to live in, but it's really the extent of opportunity which I kind of naturally gravitated to, Alexia, and I think that's really pretty deeply enshrined in the city for a couple of reasons. One, kind of as a city, the Gold Coast is 61 years old at the moment. And if you think about most 61-year-old things, that's kind of generally kind of in the kind of generational change transition period. And so there's this really kind of palpable sense of the Gold Coast growing into its next phase of a city. As both a city in a kind of a built form sense and also as a community of citizens. And that's really exciting. And what has been really kind of motivating for me over the last couple of years is trying to do our bit to contribute to being one of a many number of custodians of that change process as we move through to the next generation of what the Gold Coast will be, and try and understand kind of what makes the city tick to begin with, and kind of what the foundations and cornerstones of the city and its community were and still are, but then also trying to turn our minds to the future and how we can shape the best future for the city as a place to live and a place for families and to do business. And so that sense of change, I suppose, to put it that way, I find really motivating. The other thing which I love about the place, which I just didn't appreciate till I got here. I mean, I grew up in Brisbane, and for anyone come from a similar background, there's that sibling relationship between the cities. Very few people kind of grow up in Brisbane and aspire to work on the Gold Coast. I was one of those, hadn't thought about it, but when the opportunity presented itself, and I came and kind of rolled my sleeves up, I really kind of fell in love with the spirit of the city and the culture of doing business. And I don't see that business culture. I don't see that sense of opportunity represented in the same way in the other cities around Australia that we work in. So that's a kind of a powerfully compelling spirit which drives the way that business is done on the Gold Coast, and really importantly for today's discussion, drives the way that I think that we need to approach kind of planning and designing cities. I might move into kind of some broader reflections then on kind of the Urbis experience of arriving on the Gold Coast. As I understand today, topic kind of some of reflections on how, from a kind of a business perspective, we establish and then grow is something of interest to everybody on the call today. So, by way of background, we're about 4 years in, 5 years in February, we'll have kind of had a standalone Gold Coast office at Urbis. For those of you who kind of don't know, I mean, Urbis started about 50 years ago in Melbourne, is really now kind of the culmination of a coalition of various kind of professional disciplines that have come together. With a very strong planning focus, but over the last kind of 15 or so years, increasingly a focus on urban design, landscape architecture, economic development, property economics more broadly, valuations, community engagement, economic and social advisory, and a handful of other bits and pieces. And we hold two things kind of really dear as an organisation, which have I feel kind of have helped us establish what we do on the Gold Coast. The first of all is that we've got a kind of a house view that it's incumbent on all of us as kind of professionals and citizens to be generous with our ideas for the city, and that we should, wherever possible, take the opportunity to kind of draw on our expertise and experience to share opinions about the city and how to make cities and communities better places. And that we should try to lead public discourse as best as possible, whilst keeping one eye on the kind of commercial realities of our business, but being really important kind of us civic participants with kind of a professional expertise is really important, and that's something that we've drawn on. And the other thing that we hold kind of really dear as an organisation, which I think is kind of an interesting discussion point in the Gold Coast, is the imperative for collaboration. We've found, as our business has established and grown nationally and up into Singapore, but also in the microcosm of the Gold Coast, that the best opportunities, the most interesting work, the most rewarding work, and most significant work in a city sense, we find is where we are collaborating both internally across our business lines, but also more broadly in the kind of design and professional services community in the city. So being generous with ideas and time, which is one of the reasons why I do the things that I do in addition to my role at Urbis, together with that kind of fierce pursuit of opportunities for collaboration, are the two things that we kind of led with when we arrived in town. and you'll see us do a lot of thought leadership and a lot of external facing things to serve that purpose. What I found reflecting on the kind of last 4.5 years is that putting those two objectives at the front of how we invest our time and effort allowed us to quite genuinely demonstrate that we were interested in the bona fides of the city moving forward. And I didn't realise this kind of at the time when we started it, but what has transpired is that people, that's kind of resonated with people. It's resonated with leaders in other sectors across the city. It's resonated with a lot of the elected representatives, and it's resonated with the with parts of the community. And it's, you know, pretty basically about just kind of not being in it for our own commercial interests. We're obviously all business people. We need to make a living, but demonstrating those bona fides about your kind of passion for the city and involvement in the city allowed us to build a professional network, and ultimately has kind of assisted us to kind of build a level of influence and a particular role in the city, which has ultimately then led to some commercial opportunities for us as well. When we established the Gold Coast office, I mean, I was amazed actually. So I was working for a competitor of Urbis at the time when I was asked to come and kind of set up the shingle more significantly, and it had amazed me that Urbis hadn't kind of arrived on the Gold Coast earlier. When you think about kind of the 6th largest city in the country, fast growing, with a less mature professional services market than we see in kind of capital cities, I was always kind of expecting Urbis to turn up with its kind of planning, economic development and design focus and have an important role to play in the city. And then I was kind of fortunate enough to set that up. I had the opportunity to kind of run off a really good base, which I think is kind of a helpful reflection to offer. First of all, I was working on the Gold Coast prior to that, but I had been kind of trying to do the Brisbane Gold Coast thing, but we quickly learned that really, again, because it's a kind of a parochial city and it's a growing city, you need to have your boots on the ground here. It's very hard to do it as a kind of a satellite office model. Obviously, there's kind of a transitional period where you set up, but certainly our experience was that we found that kind of what we were hoping to do was better received in the city once we demonstrated to ourselves that we were here with boots on the ground and invested in the city as a business, as well as people. And that was actually quite transformative in terms of how Urbis had tried to kind of limp along with a satellite model, have the Brisbane business card and the Gold Coast business card, but really people are kind of running down from Brisbane and pretending to kind of be deeply involved. There's a role for that, but there's an expiry in my experience on how long that can be the basis of any business model. And so the imperative to grow quickly and sustainably, get enough kind of foundations and roots down to support a permanent presence, and then kind of investing deeply in kind of conversations in the city was really important for us. The other thing, coming back to that kind of collaboration point, I found is that certainly in our market, everybody was kind of a specialist. So there were very few multidisciplinary firms other than some of the bigger engineering houses, and then kind of everyone else was a kind of a specialized practice. And that, of course, is still kind of a really important way to go about things. But what we sensed was that was contributing, as well as a series of other things, to there being not enough collaboration on projects and on kind of city ideas. And so when we kind of started to diagnose where we thought the opportunity was, and I still think this is where the opportunity is, it's about that collaborative piece of actually kind of building on your own technical specialization, and wheeling in particularly an appreciation of economic development in the broader sense for the city, and also in our world, kind of coming from a planning background into kind of an increasing contribution to the design side of things. because there's, you know, a well-established architecture market on the Gold Coast, there was and still I think is, a less well-established urban design, kind of public realm design market on the coast, and so the opportunity to bring those three things together was something that's assisted us. Finally, the thing I'll say about kind of how we've arrived at this point is coming back to this question about the kind of the business culture in the city. And understanding that and how to kind of make it work. How I've come to describe that is that I've found the Gold Coast to be an egalitarian city, very fair, and so if and kind of lacking some of the kind of institutionalized prejudice and some of the nostalgia that we see in pockets of other cities. And so kind of understanding how this is a progressive city which is future focused but has these challenges in terms of scale, community identity, generational transition is really important, as trying to understand kind of who's who in the zoo, how politicised some of the planning process is, and what kind of businesses and professions like those that we're all engaged with can contribute to the city, and then making sure that you've got a good appreciation of how the city ticks, and then making sure you set up your business plans and project opportunities to kind of fall into those slip lanes. So that's kind of how we've got to where we are. You know, we're kind of working pretty hard. You're never quite sure what's around the corner, as everyone on the call appreciates, but we've kind of got to a critical mass now and starting to feel like we're coming into our own kind of second iteration of what the business is and how we can play our role in the city.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm just going to address the questions in the chat box. That was fantastic insight. I really appreciate that. The first question is from Mark Burrows, and he's asked, what are the unique characteristics of doing business on the Gold Coast versus other capital cities? I feel like that's been quite well addressed in your presentation so far. Mark, as we continue, we're going to move on to the next question, but if there's something in specifically that wasn't covered, if you could please insert it into the chat and we'll rewind back to your question again. The next question is from myself. You mentioned in your presentation, Matthew, that there was a period of time, so obviously you'd had established your brand somewhat locally before you moved across to Urbis, but this might be something that you could reflect on, not just from Urbis experience, but I'm sure you get a lot of insight what other firms are looking to start up on the Gold Coast and move across, particularly in the architectural space. So how long did Urbis invest, or do you see other firms investing in the Gold Coast before they're seeing commercial results? Is it varied, or have you seen it?
Yeah, look, I think it's varied. You know, they all kind of start with a kind of a subsidised model. We were fortunate to be able to kind of wash our face in year one. But what were we? We were 3 people, so it was kind of a modest beginning, and we tried to focus on making sure we could kind of wash our face. The growth in the first year or two was pretty good. It's accelerated from there. But my sense is that in terms of that kind of shallow to deep investment, how long do you kind of get to really demonstrate that you're here and you stayed, kind of the start up to scale up kind of bridging thing. I reckon that's 18 months to 2 years, and we see a lot of businesses kind of come and go in that time frame. One of the really interesting things that we've done more recently is actually some analysis at a citywide level about the startup to scale up proposition, and it's one of the challenges that faces the Gold Coast at the moment that we see a lot of opportunity in the future for, is that there's a bucket load of startups, and it kind of sits really comfortably with this small business capital of Australia kind of idea, and it's intensified through the COVID journey. I was just looking at some figures earlier on, but the scale up challenge is the one that's tricky for people to navigate. And then from a city perspective, it's of those businesses which do scale up, how do we make sure we can keep them here rather than them running up the road or down to Sydney to capital city markets? And that's kind of one of the challenges for the city, moving into the future. So, I think you kind of 18 months to 2 years is a pretty sensible horizon. and it's a pretty hectic period, of course, but you get a good sense for it early. I mean, it's because it's a relatively small city. Once you kind of unpack it, you can get a pretty good read on things, and I think that's one of the reasons it's important to have your boots on the ground and kind of immerse yourself deeply in the community, including the business community, so you can get a good read on your prospects moving forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And as somebody that's worked across Brisbane and lived Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, and then when I lived in Brisbane, I would be working on the Gold Coast. I can personally reflect that all of your insights are true to what I experienced and what I've heard, not just in conversations to you and through my own experience, but from others that are looking to do business on the Gold Coast. So it's fantastic to be able to share that insight with people today. I think we're ready to move into the next section of today's presentation. And Stephen Bayer has actually asked a question, which is a nice one to lead into it. So thank you, Stephen. The question is, the Gold Coast has grown quickly and significantly. What does its future growth look like, and how does Urbis fit into the change in growth?
Great question. Great question. Well, I think the future looks really bright for the city is the first thing to say about that. And the COVID experience, which I don't kind of want to focus on too much, but of course is a relevant consideration. It's kind of emphasised the nuts and bolts of that future proposition. Kind of on the negative side, it's of course exposed the reality, in case anybody had ever gone close to forgetting it, that the economy of the Gold Coast is very reliant on tourism and construction. And I'll come to kind of how construction and property more broadly has been performing, which is a good news story, but because the tourism side of the equation has had a horrid time and still has some difficulty that lies ahead. Just kind of for context, so tourism and property are about the same size in the Gold Coast economy, both about $5.5 billion in gross regional product contribution, and both account for around about 20% of the full-time jobs directly in the city, and then the indirect thing. So, there has been a lot of great work done and some really tangible results achieved in diversifying the basis of the economy into areas like health, education, sport, and a few others, arts and culture, but there is still a long way to go before that's a kind of a properly diversified economic base. And so the reality is that we're confronted as a city with kind of an economy which is very focused and reliant on property and tourism for at least the foreseeable future. Having said that, I think the future, I'm really optimistic about the future for a couple of reasons. One, I think that challenge and that opportunity is well understood by leaders of the city. I think it's well understood by federal and state government as well, but in the competition for kind of public sector investment at a national and state scale, it gets a little bit more difficult. But certainly I would say there's kind of a coalition of the willing across all three levels of government and public and private sector to understand that economic diversification challenge is still very much a focus for us, that we need to galvanise around it and be very kind of focused on delivering. The other interesting thing to have come out of the last few years, and then again amplified by the COVID experience, is the city's growth being so dependent on population-driven economic growth. And this is really interesting, actually, I think. So over the last couple of years, the city's grown above average compared to most other cities in the country at around about 2.5% per annum, I think, and that's forecast to continue, which puts us at a city of 1 million people by about 2041. The net overseas migration side of things has been an important contributor to that, and increasingly so over the last couple of years. The kind of COVID gates going down has been cause for some concern about that. But what we have seen since about April this year, anecdotally, and then last week, I'm pleased to say, moving from anecdotal evidence to some new figures from the ABS, is that there's a genuine interstate migration thing on. And we already were sensing over the last couple of years that Sydney siders were getting the Gold Coast again. The Commonwealth Games was a fascinating thing. Our experience was Brisbane generally kind of didn't really get the Commonwealth Games. Half of the Gold Coast didn't get the Commonwealth Games. Half the people left the city, and the other half of us kind of stayed. But Sydney really got the Games experience, and it dragged a lot of Victorians up again to visit. And that was really important in terms of city reputation. And so we saw kind of an uptick and an increased appreciation of kind of the contemporary Gold Coast versus the 1970s, 80s version of the Gold Coast come out of that, which was building, particularly in New South Wales. Then kind of COVID happened. And like I said, since April, there's been a stark increase in project work driven by Victorian investors, Victorian developers, ahead of what we expect to be a relatively significant influx of Victorian interstate migrants as soon as they're allowed to get out of Victoria and into Queensland, and that's already bearing out in the ABS figures. So for the COVID quarter through to the end of June, interstate migration numbers were actually up about 1,300 people on the previous quarter, which had been kind of pretty strong. So I think the future of the coast will involve, certainly in the kind of the short to medium term, an increased role for interstate migration out of Victoria as well as New South Wales. We continue to see an interesting kind of transfer of people between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. What I think underlies that, which is really important to the kind of work that we all do, is that if there's a silver lining to the very dark storm cloud that is COVID, it's that it's helping us solve the biggest handbrake we've ever had on growth in the city, which is the jobs issue. So non-capital city, how do you get the breadth of jobs, the depth in the employment market to enable people to live here if they need to work? And I think at various times in its history, the city's kind of fallen into the trap of trying to compete with capital city employment markets, where the better approach is to understand kind of what the unique proposition is and try to be a little bit more kind of fierce in pursuing unique opportunities for employment growth on the Gold Coast. What COVID has done, and we've seen it, is reminded everyone that they've got the flexibility to work and live in different locations if that works for them, and that people otherwise have more flexibility. I think the greatest example of this is the CFO of the AFL, the most Victorian kind of experience around, ran the AFL competition from a beachside house in Palm Beach for this season. And I was speaking with him the other day, and he was saying, well, look, I don't actually have to go back to Melbourne. So if you can run the AFL from outside Melbourne, there are plenty of other employers and employees who I think will embrace the opportunity to have people live here. That's really important because it solves that challenge we've had in terms of a competitive tension with other cities about how to create jobs. I think the other thing that our future needs to focus on, a couple. So we need to get away, and I think this is true of all Australian cities, but it's particularly true for the Gold Coast. We need to get away from relying so heavily on population-driven growth and look instead at where there's opportunities for productivity-driven growth and some alternative markets. I think there's some kind of interesting opportunities that arise out of that. The build-to-rent market is one of the things that I sense could get some real momentum out of that change. If you combine still historically low rental vacancy rates on the Gold Coast at the southern beaches, so kind of Coolangatta, Palm Beach, rental vacancies at the moment are down as low as 0.6, 0.4%, some of the lowest in Australia. But the city and the economy is still very much kind of based on a high proportion of transient workers and a high demand for renters. So the market fundamentals from a demand side are there and a supply side in terms of build to rent. What I really like about build to rent as an opportunity is it's kind of a sub market opportunity. It's a new investment market, and really importantly, again, one of our kind of long-term challenges on the Gold Coast has been how you get institutional grade investment here. And starting to look at built form opportunities and economic opportunities focused around, kind of 30-year returns at institutional grade level of investment, but still with its roots in property, actually opens up kind of an institutional grade investment market that doesn't exist previously. So education is the other piece of that. There's an increasing discussion about the vertical school proposition on the Gold Coast as land supply comes under some pressure. A kind of strong level of growth in terms of school-age children, and a recognised undersupply in education facilities at the state government level, and kind of an increasing interest from the private sector to invest in school campuses across both public and private schools. So I think these opportunities to kind of diversify into these other parts of the economy, which are really important. There's an opportunity for a renewable energy and kind of biofuels and a logistics hub up in the northern quarter of the Gold Coast where the cane fields are. I think that's one of the things we need to just stop and think about a little bit carefully before we go kind of with the traditional development model through some of the undeveloped parts of the city. How do we make sure that we accommodate population growth in a particular way but keep the job growth thing going? And really importantly, at the core of all of that is that the forecast population growth has been mandated in an 80% apartment, 20% detached dwelling split on the Gold Coast. And as a linear city with huge levels of investment being made in public transport infrastructure and other infrastructure along the spine of the Gold Coast where that 80% of population growth needs to be accommodated. We've got as much, if not more than other cities, to confront this challenge about how we do design in more urban environments well. The missing middle discussion about in terms of both kind of price point and geography and what that means for architecture and design is really important. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for the architecture profession to lead that discussion, because we need to put design at the forefront of the future of the city, and we particularly need to put public realm at the forefront, because it's just one of those things. It's a point of maturity for the city, I think, where up until now there's been enough land and everyone's kind of done things in most instances kind of looking at their own site and their own project, and the city's now at a point where we need to start understanding those in-between spaces in the public realm and what that can contribute to city identity, investment attraction, and all of those things. So that puts the design kind of practices at the forefront of the city's future, and we need to do that in a way where we're really crunching what the kind of the contemporary architectural vernacular for the Gold Coast is. We talk about that as subtropical urban. What's that look and feel like? How do we make sure that is an authentic representation of the Gold Coast as a city? How does it work well for us? How do we make sure that we can deliver that without with one eye on the kind of the economics of a non-capital city market, and how do we open up the missing middle on the Gold Coast, because we haven't had that. Even still, if you look at the apartment market at the moment, there's very little product between $600,000 and 1.2 million. There's kind of housing lands out the back, and then there's the luxury stuff on the beach. But that owner-occupier piece, those kind of affordable to aspirational midpoints, designed well, but in a way that can still be delivered, is a key for us.
Thank you, Matthew. It's interesting that what you've outlined there, it sounds to me like as you see some of the growth opportunities for jobs come to the city, the missing middle will then have to follow. Otherwise, they won't be able to sustain the right amount of employees in the city to be able to meet its growth aspirations. So it seems that it's on the way, but not quite there yet. I can understand the vision and the direction that the city's going in. Sorry, everyone, you can see a little dog in the background. I'm broadcasting from my living room, as everyone from Melbourne is right now. Please excuse my pet. I have a question for you, and I also would like to refer back to one of the comments that you made. I'm interested to learn more about the city's plans. It seems very logical with all of the great transport planning that the city is doing, to then anchor logistics planning associated with that. How far down the line are those? I mean, that really creates the lifeblood for all the rest of and the lifelines for all the rest of the city's operations to be run smoothly. So, makes sense to me that that's a key priority area that you've listed that's on the agenda. How far down the line is that thinking?
Yeah, great question. Very early on, so it's something that really hadn't been well contemplated. Kind of, the transport infrastructure discussion has still mostly been about the challenges of getting people around in private cars. Even active transport has had a relatively slow kind of gestation. It's starting to catch up now. I think one of the really interesting things about the whole light rail discussion is that it had been jammed for years in a debate about the development that might happen around the light rail network. And there had been, frankly, very little, if any, discussion about the imperative for public transport. And so you kind of got active transport and public transport now starting to come into the discussion more broadly. Those two are ahead of the kind of logistics and freight discussion. But to their credit, the council is just in the final stages of preparing its first freight plan, which is, I think, going to be a really important piece of work, particularly to try and unlock advanced manufacturing, which is kind of at the heart of what the Southport Health and Knowledge Precinct has been about, and that's been there as kind of a precinct idea for 10 to 15 years, and kind of got going in fits and starts, but hasn't really kind of built up momentum yet. So I think the logistics side of all of that is really important, as it is for the northern end of the Gold Coast, where you actually have the two biggest freight routes in Queensland, the Pacific Motorway and the Logan Motorway, come together. And so and land available, which isn't available at the southern end of the Brisbane city, and Logan kind of having their own strategic view about things in the middle. So it's early days, but I think I'm kind of heartened by the fact that it's now kind of coming in for some of its own pieces of work, and I'm sure we'll pick up and move forward. The investment in Gold Coast Airport is a really important part of that. And the airport, despite being at something like 4% of their passenger capacity at the moment, as they just kind of struggle to hang in there amongst COVID, has some really fantastic master planned and kind of business case led work about what the role of freight out of the Gold Coast and logistics is from Gold Coast Airport as well. So I think we'll see an increasing focus on that over the coming couple of years.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Also appreciate your comments around the focus in the city and, the urban planning and public realm. That really being the second part of the heart to what's going to see people connect with the city and stay and enjoy it and be a welcoming place to be, and what our industry and our members' role is in being able to contribute to that. And I think it's really great insight to understand that the local city has those aspirations, and that area of focus presents an opportunity to be able to think differently and to be able to come forward with design solutions that potentially might not be a priority in other areas. So that was great insight from yourself. Thank you for that. In the current segment or the majority of buyers in the residential space on the Gold Coast, just asking this question based off of your comments in property currently leading the way in economic growth of the Gold Coast. Who is the majority of the segment that you're seeing? Are they people that are at the later stages of their career, as you mentioned before with your colleague, was it from the AFL? Is that just the type of buyer that you're typically seeing, and who would be designing for now? And then, as we mentioned before, we'd then move across to designing for the middle, potentially in the next 12 months.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there is still a significant representation of kind of retirees or kind of mature professionals, and we see that having driven a lot of the kind of luxury product on the beach, which is kind of north of 2.5-3 million, one per floor units. That is a limited market, both in terms of purchaser and sites. and we're starting to see some of the challenges of transitioning away from that and broadening out at the moment. A really good example of that is, again, kind of in a linear city where the strategic planning is instructing or directing us to kind of put the density along that light rail corridor. One of the things that's really important to understand about the Gold Coast and is a key focus for us at the Property Council is the challenges that site amalgamation and strata title schemes present to urban regeneration along that corridor. And this is kind of a pressure point in the city at the moment, where there are development opportunities on smaller sites, which then kind of create discussion around the interface between adjoining properties and scale of project versus some of the barriers to site amalgamation. And that's something that we need to work through as a city over the next 12 months, I would say. But I certainly do hope that with the state government election out of the way now, that we might be able to get as a city some traction on the strata title reform discussion. It's a really hard, kind of wicked problem to solve, because the easy argument against it is that there's always someone who's at risk of being kicked out of their house. But I like to think that there's checks and balances that can be introduced, and we can learn from the New South Wales experience and others around Australia about how to manage that process. And I think that's really important, because otherwise we're forced back to site amalgamation prematurely. And one of the things which has been fantastic for the city and its economic base over the decade or so since the GFC was that we got away from unrealistically big projects. So this is, one of the challenges in Surfers Paradise, where we still have city blocks, whole city blocks, kind of hectare blocks, which in many instances have approvals for 3 or 4 tower schemes on them, hundreds, if not thousands of apartments. And of course, they're too big for anyone to build. But a lot of those were yield chasing the land acquisition and site amalgamation costs. And so I don't think there's too many voices that would argue against the proposition that the economy is more sustainably based if we do a larger volume of smaller scale projects well. But we need to be careful that we don't kind of set up our policy and regulatory system and kind of our approach to design to force people to site amalgamations for one reason or another. And so that's the really important role that the architecture profession can play, right, in terms of how we can sensitively manage the interface and these kind of nuances of our urban fabric in a way that allows us to kind of set the economy up sustainably, but make sure we're maintaining the lifestyle proposition and the identity of the city. And that's going to be really key. The other thing I'd say, to come back more directly to your question, Alexia, is so if the existing purchases at that kind of more mature and high-end level are a big part of it, the federal government stimulus out of the COVID response around home builder, so land, house and land stuff, has had an enormous impact. Most projects across Queensland, most land development projects across Queensland increased their sales by between 300 and 1,500% off the back of that initiative. And that has intensified the pressure on kind of land supply, which was doing the heavy lifting in terms of kind of young families. And so is, again, kind of, increasing the imperative to get this missing middle proposition right in our urban neighbourhoods. And we need to do that with the right scale of project. So what we're seeing now is that some of the early developers coming in with a good appreciation of this missing middle market opportunity, coming in at somewhere between 70, 80 odd units, price pointed somewhere between 600 grand and 1.2, and trying to do those well on sites of typically 800 to 1,200 square metres along the urban renewal corridor, close to amenities. So that's kind of the opportunity and the challenge. And like I say, making sure that the kind of design outcomes that we're achieving in that segment of the market for that price point buyer, I think is the really interesting challenge for all of us in the property industry at the moment.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. There's a question from Mark Burrows, but I'm just going to skip forward one and then circle back to Mark's in a moment, only because Ben's is directly related to what we've just discussed. So Ben Percy's asked, wondering how Gold Coast will balance investor holiday real estate market versus family living market. So that dovetails onto your comments quite well. And it's interesting if you think about the Gold Coast historically, because that's also a part of the issue why you have strata reform is long overdue on the Gold Coast, because it's primarily been an investor holiday market and it's transforming. So that speaks to the heart of what the problem is from its historical presence in Australian society and what it contributed, and that's transforming. So you've mentioned how we're looking to reach the missing middle and what will be the priorities and how we'll be able to look at the price point and what mechanisms the market can use to do that. But then we need to still think about, I still love holidaying on the Gold Coast. It's a fun place to be and there's beautiful people there. So there is that other balance to consider. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very fair comment, and I think the excellent or the best worked example of that challenge is Surfers Paradise, which is kind of ground zero for tourism in a tourist town. And the other thing that we all know, of course, is that the demands of tourists these days are different to what they were 30 years ago, and very few of us like to travel around now and just go to the tourist traps. And so tourists follow the locals. And so I think the Surfers Paradise opportunity as a proxy for how we meet this challenge through the city more broadly is to actually be really explicit and really unashamed about prioritising getting locals back into Surfers Paradise, because if we can crack that nut, then we know the tourists will follow as well. My own view is that is always to favour kind of a design and market response to that challenge rather than a regulatory one. I would have concerns if we were to, for example, kind of stipulate short-term accommodation and permanent residential zones. I think that probably starts to take us back to the old kind of land use planning approach where we segregate all the land uses and then wonder why all of our roads and public transport fill up trying to move people from one part of the city to the other. That compared to a more contemporary kind of blended zoning approach where we instead, trust good architects and good technical practitioners to come to terms with the interface issues between land uses in both the design and operational sense is a better way to go. Of course, that's pretty much just what Airbnb does. So you get these kind of blended buildings. And I think for the most part, the city actually handles this pretty well. We had a challenge in this city for a while where people would kind of blow in for their bucks weekends and hens weekends and these party house ideas, which were creating real kind of amenity issues in some more established residential areas. But there's ways to kind of regulate out that challenge. But I think it's those kind of quite narrow problems that are the domain for regulation. How we confront getting the right kind of balance and symbiosis, I suppose, between the tourist proposition and the resident proposition is something that I think we can just deal with through good design and kind of good market responses together with the jobs piece. That's what's going to separate those two things. So we just need to make sure we do both well.
Thank you, Matthew. I will circle back to Mark's question now. How is the Gold Coast responding to growth in
North New
South Wales, being an employment centre for the wider region? Is it becoming a capital for the region, or does the border impact this? Well, that's an interesting question right now.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah, well, I mean, happily, my job doesn't depend on votes, so I'm happy to be a little bit less political about this than a lot of the other commentators, I suppose. But look, the current border issues have undoubtedly created some challenges. It's also highlighted some pretty obvious things, actually. Like there wasn't a Queensland cross-border commissioner. So I think New South Wales had one from memory, but Queensland didn't. And so just having a representative, so senior representative in state government and perhaps even at a kind of a council level that is charged with kind of managing the realities of having a border run through the kind of southern end of the Gold Coast and northern New South Wales could be a good start. Because like most challenges, often the solutions are quite easy, but the difficulty is kind of drawing them out and then executing them. And so that will be interesting. I mean, I suspect that we'll see that border kind of move from a firm solid line to an increasingly dashed line over the next decade or so. Tweed Shire is doing some work around light rail themselves at the moment, which starts to throw up relatively long-term opportunities still, but kind of connecting the public transport systems in across the border. It'd be great if we could avoid the mistakes of the past and actually manage to build the light rail rails at the same gauge on both sides of the border rather than doing it differently in every jurisdiction. But I think that together with both the jobs and living proposition, I expect to see blend. We already know, there's lots of people who enjoy the fantastic lifestyle of kind of Kingscliff, Cabarita, and are commuting back to Varsity Lakes, Robina, Central Gold Coast to work, and that's still kind of an easier commute than the people going from the northern end of the Gold Coast to Brisbane in many respects. So I do think we'll see that role change. I think the lowercase politics of it all are interesting, because certainly the northern New South Wales kind of philosophy seems to be that we really like kind of what it is, and we don't want to be the Gold Coast, and the Gold Coast is kind of borrowing from the lifestyle proposition. So I think we're going to have to find a way for those two complementary parts to work together, but that creates another great opportunity for more variation in the places we live and work, but it's going to take kind of a nuanced approach so that neither side of the border gets kind of thrown out as the baby with the bathwater as that border blurs.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that. I have the next question from Pia Williamson. Matt, how do you see local architects practically participating in the coalition of the willing for the sustainable growth in our city when it seems good design is not commercially valued on par with development profit? Does that depend on your client, or is that citywide, would you say? I just want to step in there quickly to say I think a good client understands how they're going to get wins with the council and get a development approved, and if the council have set that as a priority, it seems to be a bit of a non-negotiable. Or am I incorrect there?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Pia, and Pia and I have spoken about these kind of things before. Look, I think it would be an oversimplification to suggest that either side of the ledger have the kind of rub of the green at the moment. That's how it's reported, but that's kind of mainstream media dumbing things down. Where I see the opportunity, which is what we try to do, is absolutely as advocates for good design outcomes on individual projects, and that's the role that we can all contribute. That's how we can contribute to the city, and that some of those projects are private sector development projects, some of them are strategic projects for council and government, but in whichever project we might be involved with, that's kind of the obligation and the opportunity for us as practitioners to get those wins, and that if we're kind of principled and consistent about that over time, they come. You don't get them on every project, but I think it's part of our responsibilities as professional advisors. I mean, we try to start all of our meetings with private sector clients by saying that we're paid to be advisors, not their friends. And so if we've got to tell them that their baby's ugly, we'll tell them that their baby's ugly. And then we try to focus on where the opportunities are. What I've found, particularly over the last, I would say 3 or so years, is that there is an approach and a language to doing that which speaks to the commercial imperatives of some of our private sector clients in terms of return on investment, market cut through, brand recognition, and that if you can kind of stitch together what's good for the city with an expression of that in what's good for the project, then that discussion actually becomes quite easy. but it falls to us as advisors to first of all unpack what the opportunity for the city is, understand what our clients' commercial needs are, and stitch those two things together to get a win-win situation. And that's how I see the day-to-day experience, and I think that's the nuance which sits behind the sometimes kind of oversimplified perception that it's either good design or develop a profit.
Yeah, I think that good design meets both parts of the spectrum. I mean, that's the challenge, and that designers face every day, is being able to keep in mind that they have multiple audiences that are looking and acknowledging and utilising their designs, and multiple client bases. So your first client base isn't necessarily your end user. And that's the challenge that good design meets, and will continue to face that challenge forever. That's what designers are there to do, is sit in the middle and balance all of those needs. It's what makes the industry unique and special.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with that. And I think what has made that perhaps a bit more difficult than it could have been is where the city's kind of at, and what the kind of contemporary idea of the city is in terms of built form. And we had a new planning scheme that came in 2016, which talks to things like transformation from suburban neighbourhoods to quite intense urban neighbourhoods along these urban regeneration corridors, and speaks to things like subtropical architecture, but has been left for kind of individual projects to understand that over the last couple of years. The council, to their credit, have been doing a lot of background studies to try and put the flesh on the bones of that. But I think we're coming out of a number of years where there hasn't been as much guidance around what that actually looks and feels like, and so it's been left to too few projects to unpack what that is and then execute it well, and some other stuff's kind of slipped through as well. So I'm optimistic that we'll kind of get more guidance, a better, deeper understanding across the city and the professions about where we're going, and that will make that kind of project by project advocacy piece easier for all of us.
Thank you. Appreciate those comments. I think that it's something that we're seeing growing around Australia, that council is providing more guidance that does help to meet those objectives that you've outlined. It's something that council is understanding. Across Australia, they can participate in those conversations at a more engaged level and provide better quality information to get good design outcomes. So I've seen council's role changing across the nation.
And I think, so just quick, while I remember, I think it's unfair to leave all of that task to council or government, and this is the increased role that I'd love to see some of the institutes provide. So, the Planning Institute, as kind of town planners lead group, is getting more engaged in the kind of the discussion and the coalition and whittling thing, and I'd love to see your institute do the same.
Yeah, we'll have our head of policy be able to follow up in today's session and talk to you about what we're doing in that space. Yeah. Not my area, unfortunately, but we do engage with local government quite often. Yeah. It's a part of our day-to-day and what we do, looking across the nation at all these issues. We've got another question here from Mackenzie Barclay. So, obviously, for the Gold Coast to thrive, both in terms of urban geography and economic growth, the increased density of the coastal nodes and their linkages throughout the city is very important. How can this be achieved without compromising the distinctive character of places like Burleigh and Currumbin, and maintaining a sense of place and scale that may have been compromised in places like Service Paradise and Broadbeach? It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a ripper. And look, the short answer for me is neighbourhood plans. So the kind of the journey of the planning, town planning regulation in this city was that prior to the introduction of this planning scheme, we had a planning scheme that had local area plans in them, and they were the domain of some of that fine-grained character. For a variety of reasons, those local plans didn't come through into the current city plan. And I think on one level, that was an understandable decision, because we'd got to the point where everybody felt like they needed a local area plan, and that diminished the value of the whole body of work. I think what I would like to see is that in the high growth areas, or the areas which are planned already to transform, introducing some neighbourhood scale planning and design policy is the key to doing that, with a really meaningful and community engagement piece in that. The obvious example here is to do neighbourhood plans at particular centre locations along the light rail stages, which will soon commence. So that picks up initially Nobby Beach, Miami and Burleigh Heads, and then starts to move into areas if stage 4 is rolled out, like Palm Beach and Currumbin that Mackenzie asks about. I think that's the best way to make sure that we get the balance right between accommodating growth and not just maintaining character, but I would say managing the transition of character, because I think some of those areas will have quite a different character, and that is a purposeful objective of the planning scheme already in force. It's just kind of unpacking what that looks and feels like, which is important, and getting that down on a piece of paper. This is really important for a whole bunch of reasons, not only for those kind of communities and the city as an agglomeration of them as a whole, but also to the prospects of actually successfully delivering that really important city infrastructure, because it's a fair criticism for people to level at the moment to look, if they're in Palm Beach or Currumbin, at the planning scheme and see that the land use designations are in many respects exactly the same as exist in Surfers Paradise and Broadbeach. And so there's no part of the planning scheme that I can take somebody to say, these are the rules which are going to ensure that what is delivered in Palm Beach is different to Broadbeach. And in the absence of that kind of comfort in the provisions, we have kind of pockets of community concern about precisely this issue, and I say that's quite fair, because there's nowhere to point to reassure people that the process of change can be managed, and that's the role that neighbourhood plans could contribute to the kind of growth of the city moving forward. But we don't want to go to a situation where everyone gets a prize, because that diminishes the value of kind of fine-grained land use planning.
Thank you. Just being mindful of the time. It's 1:03. Are there any last minute burning questions? Seems that the chat box has slowed down and we've had all of our questions. So I'd just like to thank you for sharing all of your insights, being so frank and open with us today, Matthew. I'm really appreciative of that. I think you've provided a very broad level of insight, which we're very lucky to have. I'd also like to point out to all of our attendees today that we have our national awards on tonight. You're welcome to join us. And that in a couple of weeks, we have a follow-on that I think is very relevant to what Matthew's mentioned today. We have Jason Goldsworthy from Mirvac talking about their build to rent initiative and talking about the business model and what are the design imperatives associated with build to rent, to give a better understanding of how designers can engage in that market. Just referring back to what you mentioned before, it is a growth sector across Australia and important for the industry to be across. So thank you again. Everybody have a great afternoon. We'll see you at the next lean-in.
Thanks for having me. Good luck at the awards.
Thank you, Matthew.